real change, enduring change, happens one step at a time. Welcome to the Guyana Dialogue. I'm your host, Shamiza Ali. Our topic tonight is the impact of PM Modi's visit to Guyana and the electoral issues leading up to the 2025 elections. The Guyana Dialogue is being sponsored by a coordinating council of Guyanese based in the US, UK, Canada, the Caribbean, and Guyana. Funding support is by well-known philanthropist Dave Narayan from Dave West Indian Imports. Please welcome my moderator for tonight, Dr. Tara Singh.
Thank you very much, Shamiza, and welcome to our viewers.
Welcome, Dr. Tara. Our panelists tonight are Professor Muniram Puru and Dr. Gangaram Das.
Hello.
Hello, everyone.
Welcome. Our guest tonight is well known in Guyana and throughout the diaspora. He is from Iflood, West Coast, Demerara. He is a lawyer by profession. He has established himself as a leading Indian rights activist in Guyana. He served as an MP when he was the leader of the political party called ROAR. He writes commentaries regularly in the daily newspaper. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Ravi Dev.
Well, thanks for having me on, and I give all my greetings to the viewers.
Dr. Tara, please go ahead.
All right. Thank you very much. We want to thank Mr. Ravi Dev for making time available to appear in this program. I know he has been busy and he has been commuting a lot because of personal reasons. We are happy to have him here. Ravi Dev needs no introduction in Guyana. He's known throughout the Guyana, as Shamiza said, throughout the diaspora. And he has been making substantial contribution, especially to the Indian cause and even the wider community in Guyana. Before I ask you to comment on a few things, Mr. Dave, I just want to congratulate the government for rolling out the first batch of payments, 100,000 K in Region 9. Over 14,000 people received their cash grants. They missed about 5% of the people because they were not registered, but they will be paid subsequently. The government has allocated in this year budget $30 billion for this purpose, and next year another 30,000. So they allocated 60 billion in all, which means they are projecting that they have over 600,000 adults in their list to pay out. So we want to thank them. I know any process like this will not necessarily go smooth. There will be a few hiccups, but people must be patient. They will all be given the 100,000 once you're 18 and above. Now, in the third week in November, Guyana was privileged and really honored to have the visit of Prime Minister Narendra Modi to Guyana. Now, while there was a lot of excitement about that, our guests had known Prime Minister Modi before he was Prime Minister, and he was very instrumental in getting him to Guyana. And we'll ask him to comment about that because many people do not know. I think that Asif has some pictures. If you can please display it before we get Mr. Dave on. I sent you 3 pictures.
He's getting it ready.
Yeah, while he's getting it ready, that clearly shows.
It's up, Dr. Tara.
Okay. Here he's meeting Prime Minister Modi. Mr. Dave, can you see the picture?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and maybe we can start with this one here in front of us.
Okay.
On our right is Modi ji. I'm on the left. And next to me is Raj Mata Scindia, the last, in a sense, reigning queen of Rajasthan, Gwalior. Well, we were on a panel, and this goes back to 1993. This is at the Global Vision 2000 that commemorated Vivekananda's 100th anniversary of his great speech in Chicago in 1893. So we had, it was called Global Vision 2000. And the entire repertoire of Indian cultural activists, political activists, social activists, they trooped into Washington. This was at the Washington Sheraton, and they rented also the entire sports complex. Over 10,000 guests were there, and discussed this coming century, it was 1993, as to what India's role would be. And it's really extraordinary that we see a young Modi there, that in 1993, the BJP had already identified him as an upcoming leader in the next century. So we have a next picture that was shown there. That one there, this is in 2000. He and several individuals from Guyana, we went to Trinidad for the World Hindu Conference of 2000. And at that point, they had just beaten Indians in Guyana in 1998. And a group of us had formed ROAR. And we were contemplating to launch a political movement to bring the plight of Indians in Guyana and violence against them to the fore. And in the discussions at the Hindu conference, off stage, so to speak, Modi ji was involved, and he decided to visit Guyana. So when he came here, he asked for me to take him to a site where Indians had sacrificed for this nation. So I took him, of course, to the Enmore Martyrs Monument, and we are standing there. So that's him in the center. There was another individual. Nobody knows. I can't remember, sadly, who that other individual is. But I am there, and as my brother teased me with my tummy pushing the man's hand. But to add to it, he remembers that. So when he visited last month, and he came down to West Coast to meet those of us who had met him, Swami Aksharananda also, he remembered, and we reminisced about his past. It was extraordinary. I found it was extraordinary for a man who is in charge of 1.4 billion people, a nation of 1.4 billion people, could still remember details of that trip and ask for individuals and ask for space and what have you. So I thought that in itself, at a personal level, was quite extraordinary. And I think we can then segue into the implications of that. That here we are as a diaspora 180 odd years out of India, and yet the present leadership feels it's important enough to connect at a personal level with those of us in these diasporic countries. I think it's an important gesture.
You know, one of the main criticisms against Indian foreign policy is that they never paid enough attention to the diaspora, especially the people who came under the immigration system. There are quite a few scholarly articles that was written on this, and I think with a few prime ministers in the past, they have tried to make amends for this, and they have reached it out for the past 3 decades or so. Now they're beginning to make amends for the neglect of the diaspora. I don't know if you know, Mahin Gosai did some study on that. He did an article on that. But with Mr. Modi visit to Guyana, that takes that relationship to a higher level.
But Taraji, it's not by accident, because if we look at India's foreign policy vis-a-vis its diaspora, I think we can break it down into 3 phases. First, there was the colonial phase where we were shipped out as so much cargo to these 18 countries across the globe for cheap labor. And in that phase, people forget that while we were shipped out by India and India had a legislature, it was really a British legislature with some Indian members. So pretty much policy was set by the British government, the Colonial Office, the India Office in London. And so there was that phase. And when they got independence in 47, Nehru, I call that the internationalist phase. Nehru was quite imbued with the socialist ethos of that era, and he insisted on this policy of non-alignment between the superpowers at that time. But part of his non-alignment also was to be non-aligned with the diaspora, and he very clearly stated explicitly in his parliament that, as the young people say nowadays, we were on our own, that India did not and would not play a role in our affairs. So while there were several crises during the Nehruvian era, including when his daughter succeeded him, Indira Gandhi, they did not intervene. So take, for example, the expulsion of Asians from Uganda. India did not in any way come down hard on them. As late as the 80s, when you had a coup against Jairam Reddy in Fiji, India did not come down against that, even though these were clear violations. Yet they came down on apartheid, and I think rightfully so. But what was, sauce for the goose should have been sauce for the gander. These were also grave right violations. So we move from that phase, and we must give credit to Rajiv Gandhi's. From the 90s, there was a phase where they began to look at the diaspora, but they began to look more at their diaspora, what we call the NRIs, the non-resident Indians, and what they could do for India in terms of foreign policy, foreign currency, to fund their developmental plans. But this is where Mr. Modi comes in, Sri Modi ji comes in, because with the onset of the Bharatiya Janata Party, the BJP, in India, it was an explicit plank of their new India, that the diaspora was part and parcel of how they conceive India's role in the world. And they have followed through. So starting with Atal Vajpayee in the late 90s into the early 2000s, when they had the first BJP government, it was explicitly laid out. And you had, for example, the Pravasi Bharatiya Divas, the Overseas Indian Day, starting in 2003, which gave explicit recognition to the diaspora and an interaction, a formal engagement with the diaspora to both listen to the diaspora and to respond to the diaspora. With Modi ji's election in 2014, that was intensified to the nth degree. And I happened to be in India in 2015 when the then Foreign Minister Sushma Swaraj explicitly talked about the 3 C's of the Indian foreign policy vis-a-vis its diaspora, which is to, the first C was to connect to the diaspora as a two-way street, to connect them. And there were several initiatives in terms, for example, the Overseas Citizen Card, and other initiatives to connect us to India. Then the other one was to celebrate. The other C was to celebrate who we were as a people in terms of our cultural contributions, our civilizational contributions to the world. And the last one was to contribute. Most diasporas had contributed to their quote-unquote home country development, and India, like any other country, see the diaspora as assisting them with their development. And so Mr. Modi is, in a sense, standing on the shoulders of these policies, but in my estimation, intensifying these policies vis-a-vis the diaspora, and we saw it in Guyana on his visit.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that meeting with Vajpayee, I was at that meeting in Manhattan, and
Right.
we had I don't, there are quite a few people who were there. The late Sri Prakash Desai, Dr. Satish
Yes.
Prakash, etc. And we had made a request that we need some scholarships, and they looked into that, but I don't know. You know, they had appointed a roving ambassador, and
Yes.
he was supposed to follow up on that. Notwithstanding, in spite India was non-aligned, India has still played one of the most important role as a foreign aid donor to Guyana for several decades. They and China were the two greatest donors of foreign aid and technical assistance to Guyana. They outshone America, Canada, UK, all of them. So that was an important. Now, let me pass you over to Professor Buru, a man who has traveled all over the world. So,
Yeah, Ravi, today's event is special for me. It is the case of a former student teaching his teacher. You have been a champion for Indo-Guyanese rights. Some have alleged that you are a racist. Tell us, what is your understanding of racism and racial discrimination in Guyana, the current situation on these, and why your advocacy for Indo-Guyanese rights is not racist?
Well, going back to my own youth development in Guyana, we can do worse than look at Stokely Carmichael's definition of racism in his book, Black Power. And firstly, he said very, very clearly that racism is the suppression of a people, oppression of a people based on their race, based on physical criteria that you distinguish them. And I go back in the 60s when I was a young student in high school, and we talked about Stokely, and he was from the Caribbean. And, you know, Black Power excited all of us in the Caribbean, and including ourselves in Guyana. But when he came to Guyana, when he was invited by UC Guyana, and Forbes Burnham came, he spoke to the Guyanese people. In those days, our biggest auditorium was at Queen's College. I was doing my A-levels at Indians next door. And so a bunch of us went over. And Stokely very clearly talked about in Guyana, he saw that Black development should be separate from Indian development. So while there were some of us who felt that we have to strive together to develop ourselves, Stokely made that distinction, and some of us walked out. I remember Paul Tennessee was here. He walked out. I walked out. Some of us walked out from that in protest, because the point is, you come back now that you had a dictator, Burnham, who had rigged the 1968 elections. And very explicitly by 70, when Stokely came to Guyana, we were feeling that pinch. You were seeing the discrimination. So, for example, you taught me, I had 16 subjects, O-levels and 3 A-levels, and you couldn't get a scholarship. I had to get a teaching job all the way out in Bushlot in West Berbice. You couldn't get a scholarship to study and go further. So to come back to your question as to what I see as racism, first of all, you have to have power in your hands to be able to oppress another one. It's just not, racism isn't just attitudes. I don't like him because of the way he looks or his race. You have to be oppressing the individual. And that is how I see what racism is. And in that sense, I don't see how I could be called racist when all I did was to speak out against racism against Indians. As a boy, I spoke out against the discrimination that was being meted out in Guyana. So, for example, when Burnham, my father was a cane cutter, and when in 1968 profit sharing came out of the Crane Commission, and so finally, when you every year you got some profit sharing, you could buy something for your house. So I don't know if you remember, there was something called a three-piece leatherette set that you would have in the villages. It came out of that. But when you had that windfall attack, when you had that windfall profit in 1974, and you had $400 million, and in those days it was 2 for 1. So that was real money in those days, about over 200 million US. And when Burnham then expropriated that money out of the sugar industry, because as profits it should have gone to the workers. The best in those days a worker could afford was a bicycle if he did well. But that money could have put sugar workers into a whole new category. So that was the kind of discrimination when he used that levy money now to develop other parts of the economy. So when what he did with rice, like we had 5-acre rice bed by another village called Betimirzor. So when he then arbitrarily dictated that you had to sell all paddy to the government at his price, then took that paddy and then milled it on mills that he constructed and put his own people to run them. So they became the new big manager, as we call them, and then shipped that rice out, expropriated all the profits for his own people. That is racism, and that is the oppression of a people. And I could go on and on and on. Our fame is that we had small shops, small businesses. He established something called the External Trade Bureau, where he controlled all importation. Therefore, shops could only get goods to sell through the government. So they had an extraordinary thing called KSI, Knowledge Sharing Institute, that doled out food. So Indian business was ruined. You could do anything. So I don't want to elaborate and take too much time, but what I'm saying is that is what racism is, and that is what I spoke out against. And when I returned after quitting my job in New York and came back in '88, I saw that same kind of racism in operation. And the biggest racism, of course, was the PNC rigging elections, which ipso facto excluded all Indians who supported, by and large, the PPP from participating in their own governance. And that, to me, was the greatest oppression of them all. And that, as you know, went on for over 28 years. So that's how I see it. And I see fighting against racism cannot make you a racist.
Now, I want to follow up on that because some of the things you mentioned just now during the Burnham regime, I'm aware of those things. I have on 2 separate occasions requested the current Minister of Education that Guyanese history be included in the curriculum from primary schools to higher education. It is clear from her reactions that this is not going to happen anytime soon. Caribbean history is, in which Guyana is a small part, is taught to the children. I think that Guyana has its unique history, different from the island nations of the Caribbean. Some difference included some of the things you mentioned just now, include the rule of the colonial powers, the Dutch, the French, the British, slavery and revolt by coffee, indentured servitudes, with its own struggle that include the Enmore Mart, dictatorship, rigging of elections, the Wisman massacre, border issue with Venezuela, and so on. So we teach a lots of stuff to students, but not their own history, to give them a sense of who they are, a sense of belonging, a sense of identity, right? What is your opinion about this?
Well, that was one of the platforms that we demonstrated where racism was practiced in Guyana against the Indians of this land. That, coming back to my taking 16 subjects in those days, I did Caribbean history. And if you did Caribbean history as I did, there was a book, a blue-covered book by Perry and Sherlock, outline of West Indian history.
I did that book also.
And you did that all, but that was the only book we could have.
Yes.
And in the 300 odd pages, there's not more than 14 pages on the Indian experience in the Caribbean.
Yes.
Yet we're over 50% in Guyana, 40% in Trinidad, the same percentage in Suriname, a big number in Trinidad, in Jamaica, while not percentage-wise, yet we were given very, very short shrift. So it is not surprising that there was this perception about us as not being really a Caribbean people.
Mm-hmm.
So when we were excluded, it didn't bother the rest of the population because they were not taught that we were part and parcel of the creation of these lands. So, for example, when around 2003, I quoted a fellow named W.A. Green, a historian, who said that if it were not for the coming of the Indians to save the sugar industry of Guyana, Guyana's hydrology is such that we are below sea level, and it takes a tremendous expenditure to keep us drained and to make us habitable. Therefore, without an industry like sugar, we would have been swamped again, and we would have reverted to the mangrove swamps that the Dutch found when they had to clear it. So therefore, if the Indians did not come to save the sugar industry, because we know the African slaves, and I think they may be justified in their own way, that they left the sugar plantations en masse. So by 1848, more than half of them had left, but we came and we saved it. And in that sense, we saved Guyana as a viable enterprise. This is a fact which you can't pussyfoot around. Yet, if you mention that I was called a racist to say African Guyanese were lazy, has nothing to do with it. They literally left. And if I were an African, I would have left the scene of my degradation as slaves. But factually, they left and they needed labor, and we were brought here, and we worked from the moment we were brought in 1838 to the moment indentureship was finished at the grand rate of a shilling, tops, a shilling a day. Meaning whatever inflation came and went, we worked for that same wage and ground out that sugar and lived in very miserable condition. Mm-hmm. So to come back to the knowledge of our history, it is vital, and I'm saying this without any fear of recrimination, that if we don't put the history of our peoples, and all peoples, including our Amerindian people, our African people, and our Indian people, if we don't treat it seriously and teach history as a required subject on our educational curriculum, we are going nowhere. Because this kind of social comparison process, for example, Lincoln Lewis, to the consternation of many, said, well, when the Ghanaian vice president came, he wasn't treated with such pomp and ceremony like when Modi came. Now, we can address that, but where does that come from? Mm-hmm. Lincoln Lewis, as a trade unionist, you would think he would look at the class structure of Guyana, the working class, but he went to look at it from an African standpoint. Now, that's the reality. So if Lincoln is not educated to the nuances of Indian history and what we did for this country and what India has done for us vis-a-vis what Ghana might have done for us, then those kinds of odious comparison would be articulated. And again, it comes back. So I totally agree with you, Professor. I couldn't agree with you more, and I would put it up on par. We're saying we need to be technologically conscious and all of that, but all of that will go by the wind unless we understand our history, so therefore we can understand each other in this country.
Yeah, well, I think, the minister didn't give me the impression this is going to happen soon at all, at least during their time in government. So I think this, what should be done, and I want your opinion on this. I think people like yourself and many other well-qualified Guyanese historians should write history books and other resources for primary, secondary, and higher education, and then put pressure on the government to include Guyanese history in the curriculum. I think that's the only way that we can get this into the school system. What is your thought on that?
Almost 20 years ago, Professor Basdew Mangru,
I know him very well.
homegrown historian out of Albion, I believe. But we knew each other in New York. Ganga would know Basdew very well, and he, upon our encouragement, produced a very nice little simplified history of the East Indians of Guyana. And I brought from him about 200 copies and literally schlepped it personally on BB in those days, and brought it to Guyana and distributed it. And I tried to get the government of the day at that time was the PPP government to put this on the curriculum, and I was stonewalled. And I think we need to now. I think there's a greater acceptance of this viewpoint. So, for example, when I returned to Guyana in the 80s, the whole notion of ethnicity being acceptable had come from America. Daniel Patrick Moynihan had written his ethnic groups, back in the 70s and introduced the term. So it was a new term. Then when I came back, Donald Horowitz had written his ethnic groups in conflict, and that was what inspired people like me to come back here. So it was a new concept. But by now, I think people understand that your group identity is tied together with your individual identity, and it's not going to disappear. Even if you get super rich, and we see that in America today. We see group identities rising to the fore. And so while some people look at consternation at the new voting patterns and the whole liberal notion of all of we is one and one love is being thrown out for group demands, and look at that, it's America. And look at all of Europe, even the Scandinavian countries, which we thought had evolved along this liberal paradigm. They're also having group identity and the need to satisfy it. So coming back to Guyana, I say it again, that those of us who are of this belief, have to push the agenda and work with the government of the day. And I would like to believe that the PPP government in office now has shown itself more receptive to these kinds of notions than the past. In the past, for example, when I returned, I worked very closely with Chedi. I had brought him up to Gopio in 1989, where we took him to the UN and we took him to the White House and we took him to the Carter Center and so on back in 89. But Chedi personally, and without blame, this is not a blaming, he was not receptive to the notion of these kinds of identities. And but the PPP has now jettisoned Marxist-Leninism from its theoretical framework as how it sees the country. So I think we may have an easier time to make another attempt at getting them to integrate
All
these.
right. All right. This time we should get Dr. Ganga in this
Yes,
discussion.
I read Mr. Ravidev's letter in the press, and that was a very good summary in terms of what I might put as cultural revival as a spin-off from Modi ji's visit. So there was the aspect of cultural revival and business networking as well. There were some signed bilateral agreements that were there dealing with agriculture and industry and other training. So I would like you to expand on how you see cultural revival linking with our roots from India. How do you see it evolving? So that would be my first question.
Well, let me put it in perspective, because we're talking from an Indian perspective, because we have our own notion of culture, which is grounded with our lifestyle, the way we live. So, for example, it is not fortuitous that Diwali is done in the fall. because in India, in North India, where we came from, in the fall, that's when we have the big crop, whether it is rice or sugar or whatever we grew in North India. And the same thing when we came to Guyana. As a boy growing up on a sugar plantation, this was your big crop in rice. Dr. Budu comes from Windsor Forest. Big crop would be in the fall. And so you're celebrating it. It's not only Sri Ram you would welcome, that's one incident, but in large part of our culture was to be agriculturally based and to see ourselves as agriculture as part and parcel of that culture. So to come back to India and Modi ji's visit, we see that sugar is in decline, and some people are saying that it's a fatal decline. I disagree. Now that here you have India, we have already signed a memorandum with India. I think was about 4 or 5 years ago, where they have extended, I think, a $500 million credit line to their Exim Bank, in which sugar is explicitly mentioned in that MOU in terms of revitalizing sugar and all that. So I would like to feel that the culture, when we talk of culture, the sugar culture, sugar is a culture. I grew up on a sugar plantation. Sugar is as cultural as you can get. My nanny was a weeder. My nana who raised me was a shovelman. My dad was a cane cutter. So sugar, it implies knowing. There's no sugar industry. It's a sugar cane industry. And to grow sugar cane successfully, you have to be part and parcel of that culture of the country. And India has that culture. India understands that culture. So the people from India, the experts in India, can therefore lend its hand through that memorandum, through that line of credit, to try to revitalize our sugar. When the PNC had got into office and they arbitrarily closed 4 sugar plantations down, even though their own commission of inquiry had said, don't close it, you have to bring it back on its feet and then privatize, which I have no problem with. They closed it. I had gotten in touch with a manufacturer of sugar from Maharashtra, which is one of the largest producing the Maharashtra experiment. And in Maharashtra, this individual is named Deshmukh, and the Deshmukhs own several sugar factories in Maharashtra. And we asked him to make a bid for Wales estate, because Wales, and it's important to know about Wales. Wales is the only sugar plantation where over 40% of the workers and the cane farmers were of African descent. So I felt this, the PNC will at least look at this, I think, favorably. And the Deshmukhs were willing to invest. But the model they had in Maharashtra was that you had cane farmers, not cane cutters. So the land is divided up into a certain amount of acreage where a family can run. So you find that optimally 15 acres, a family can run it, very efficiently. But the factory now, and the fertilizer, and the shipping of the cane, and the milling, everything is done by one institution, which is owned. And that was the model they brought in. And I met Granger, sent me to meet his son-in-law, Gaskin, I think, right? Gaskin is his name, and to meet the Minister of Agriculture, who I know has never stepped into a sugar field. His name was Holder, and there was one other individual. I took along with me the head of the NIS, who was PNC aligned, a guy named Dr. Surendra Prasad, and I took Nigel Hughes along with me, feeling this would open up the way because it's a bipartisan approach. They refused. So to come back to the whole cultural notions there, Dr. Ganga, is that I feel we can start, it's not just this song and dance aspect. It is how we look at agriculture, how we look at production. Though we have to inculcate these values, again, it is not fortuitous that India and China have progressed the way they do, because they have integrated into their system symptoms of development, aspects of their culture. People will not change their behavior unless they see it as culturally um, opportune for them. So I would like to broaden that. I hope I answer your question, but I want to look at it a little broader.
Yeah, this is very important. My sister lives in Switzerland, and in the kindergarten schools, they celebrate the vineyard and the cow,
Mhm.
and they don't have as much land space like Guyana, and it's an opportunity we have to go back to this type of linkage with agriculture as part of cultural revival. I was in UP, and there was a big straight road just like at the plantation diamond. That's where I grew up on the estate. My father weighed the cane. He operated the scales, but he came from the field and then to the factory. So I have similar experiences, my family, and so on myself. So the thing we have to look at is not, where can we link? We can link uh, the celebratory aspects, celebrate the seasons, just like they did in Switzerland, for example, and I'm sure they do that in as you outlined in India. But languages are also very important. We have more affinity with India through cultural, pujas and singing and so on, than we have with Spanish and French. And I feel that I have lost something. I looked at Modi's opening address. I said that was a good move, just to speak in his own language, and nobody understood. And I said that should be felt and resound throughout the country. That there it was. We don't have our own languages. I'm not saying that we should have only Indian languages. We should have any language from Africa and so forth. I taught for 34 years at Lincoln University, a historically black uh, university, 34 years. And everything that they did pointed to African countries. Our presidents were very sensitive to that. And Modiji's visit to Guyana reminds me of the president of Tanzania, and just slipped his name. President of Tanzania visited Lincoln's campus, and there was the same kind of arrangement. There was the and outriders, drummers, welcome him to the campus. We had similar things for Modiji. And what you wrote in the paper from Lincoln Lewis, I have a comment in there. He didn't look at what President Ali did. He didn't look at all the other details, the finer details that welcomed the African vice president. We did those things that he was saying that we didn't do, and that it was biased. It wasn't, in my opinion. The circumstance and pomp started at the airport at CJ International, and everybody welcomed that VP. And our VP went on not a cultural mission, on a business mission to Ghana. And Modi ji combined both culture and business aspects. So we need to take the challenge up now, and ASAP start our entrepreneurship programs so we can trade import stuff from India. We need to uh, we need to teach our kids how to import a container, how to do freight forwarding, how to do warehousing, boxing, and packaging, and so forth from India. In today's paper, we have China increasing its trade by 30 something percent. We need to be able to say the same thing about India. When I visited UP, among other places, from Hyderabad and so forth, the layout of the people, the place was just like in Guyana, the same model, rice field, cane field, rice field, cane field, and the same modes of transportation. So we have these linkages. It's just that we are not aware. People in Guyana are not aware. It took more than a century for me to be the first person to visit India, and uh, I tried to go back again, and I couldn't because they denied me the visa, and that was my first contact with Modi ji. Um, when I wrote a letter complaining that my visa was turned down, and he was in campaign mode, and I think he was instrumental in opening that up. So, just to summarize, languages are important, and that could be linked. And people should have a choice of languages from their mother and root countries, and then we can start to build trade relationship and business networking. But we have to make this type of education available to the people. My trip to India, that was for which I did not have a visa, was to develop an export directory for the use by students in America. Now we can do similar things and train our students in Guyana how to trade with India. So I'd like you to expand a little on the languages part and the business networking that Modi ji has signed these various agreements on.
But what you have asked for, and I think you have done a very thorough job of, talking about what's needed. But interestingly enough, much of what you have asked for is already in play. So if you look at the ITech program that India has been running for decades, for training people in all the areas that you spoke about, in logistics and in every which way that you need to run modern businesses, that has always been available, and even today. Now, President Ali has launched the goal scheme, of which the greatest component is from universities in India, where you can be trained in each of these areas, in terms of entrepreneurship, in terms of doing what it takes to get your businesses. India is the greatest incubator of small and medium enterprises in the world today. And I'm sure when you went to India, when I go, I always make sure I take a trip to Bangalore, they call it now. And you'll be amazed as what. My first trip was back in 1997. And here I was, shopping in the bazaar. Um, uh, it's called Chandni Chowk. We must have seen it in the movies and what have you. Now, Chandni Chowk is like our Starbrook Market multiplied 100 times. But yet in Chandni Chowk, as far back as 1997, all of them could scan my card, and they had credit. And this was in 1997. So what we can learn from India is to digitize, is to improvise, and to innovate and launch businesses. And right now, the Indian government has offered these services to be available to us. So part and parcel of the whatever life is left in me is to be on West Coast where I live, is to give talks to in our villages. I went to Metimir Zorg last weekend, and you talk to the young people and let them be aware of these opportunities. The opportunities are already here, Gangaji, and we just have to then, pick them up. They're there to carry to the next level. Let's take rice. I was asked to say a few words at the Diwali Mela that President Irfan had at Leonora there. And what I pointed out is what the very spot in which that stadium lies and where we were holding this Diwali Mela was the first spot where wet rice was grown commercially successfully in Guyana. And in fact, it then launched this industry, which is now exporting 600,000 tons annually. And we need now, when you talk of training, if you go back to the the issue of Timeri of 1886. The individual who gave this opportunity spoke very candidly that a few years before 1865, an American company had tried to get rice growing in Guyana. They failed. Yet he, as the person who ran Leonora Plantation, was asked by a couple of immigrants that AUSA, could we use those land that are not being used over the seawall road? Because in those days, the public road stopped the sea from encroaching. So the land was not planted by cane. Between the public road and the waterfront, you didn't plant. And those people, and he described, for example, the technology of these people. He thought he would give them a plow. They didn't want the plow. He described it. It's there in black and white. Coming back to Professor Boudou talking about our history, this gentleman, his name is Russell, of the Russells of Scotland. He showed that how you grow rice in Uttar Pradesh and Bihar. First, you have a little plot. We call it the BRE, right? You can call it, the germination plot, where you shy the rice very thickly. Then, when they're about 8 to 12 inches, you then take them out and you tie them in bundles and you throw them into the land that you have prepared. And he described how they had prepared the land by plowing it with oxen, but using a particular kind of plow. And then when they planted the rice, how they knew when to bring in water, when to let out water, when to didn't have fertilizer in those days. You would put whatever dung you had. The point is that our people had that technology. It was a technology that even the white man, so to speak, couldn't replicate. Yet they're not given credit. On their own, you have an industry. Now, where is our future? Oil is going to run out. Whether it'll be substituted or not, that's not the issue. It's a finite resources. So what's going to keep Guyana 3 generations down? Right? The government, to its credit, has strategically talked about food security. So this is where we can now use this willingness of our people to get their toes wet, to get their toes in mud. As a young boy, I planted rice with the same motion. You take from the BRE, you take that and you plant it like this. And by the time you finish, the mud would go up to halfway up your under your thumbnail. I don't know if you ever planted, Dr. Boudou, but
I did.
yes. So the point is, though, that technique can be brought from India, and because they have also modernized it. We talked about nari and their germplasm to get better breeds of rice. India is way ahead of us. They led the Green Revolution in the 60s, and they have built on Dr. Barlog's, revolution in creating new varieties that can resist diseases,
All right.
that produce less foliage and more, of the grain and so on and so forth. So to come back to what you're talking about, India can do this. So we have to think strategically. So a lot of people say, man, India came to buy our oil. Nothing wrong with that. India is thinking ahead for themselves. Right now, Reliance, is buying 2 million barrels of oil per month from Venezuela. The American has given them a waiver on that license, so they're shipping. But once Trump comes in, they know that that's going to be cut. There are going to be new sanctions on Mad Maduro. So India is trying to hedge its bet. But we now have to hedge our bets in terms of agriculture. So look at all of the hue and cry. Mr. Modi introduced millet as the grain of the future. He is Mr. Millet. Very few people know that in 2023, he helped compose a song on millet that was nominated for the Grammys. I don't know if anybody knows that. You can play that song. It's on the web. Download it. Modi himself helped compose it. The point is, though, millet is one of the grains of the future. Dr. Irfan went to India, Modi ji spoke to him, and we tried it. The trials have worked. Now, our savannas have its own challenges. It's high in acidity, so we need, more to neutralize it. Uh, we need lime and what have you. But the point is, India has gone through all of this. And so not only do they have the technology in the people, so it's not something fancy that you have to now use drones or anything like that. You're talking of a people to people transfer of technology. Just like how my grandfather back in the day when we planted rice would take his finger, stick it into the dirt, and just put it is, and he would know whether it is acid or it is alkaline. Get me? He didn't have to go to no lab and do it. It's a kind of, you may call it folk wisdom. But coming back to your point, Dr. Ramdas, that India in its language and in its culture and its people, if you were to bring some of those people to Guyana to demonstrate, just like how our foreparents demonstrated to the white man that you could have wet rice cultivation in Guyana and make it succeed. I am telling you, we can do the same with what India needs, because India itself, as it industrializes, as America move away from China as its factory, and a lot of it goes to India, just like in China, you will have a lot of the rural people moving to cities. And therefore, India itself will need food. So you will have a market. So let's take the whole lentils family: dal, moong dal, urad dal, all the different dals that they prepare. They will need it. You will need that market, right? Just like how soya, when like now China wants soya, when Japan needed soya, the same kind of savannas we have in Region 9 on the Brazilian side. When I was in coalition with GAP, the governor of Roraima State flew me and Paul Hardy of GAP to see the huge farms that the Japanese have created to plant soya, because soya is their protein. They wanted soya. So India, I am predicting, and this is not me having any knowledge, it's plain common sense, is going to need the kind of foods that we know about, the lentils like dal and all the other things that they eat and we eat. But but they can both know how you cultivate it and who to cultivate it, and we can get going in that commonality. And that is where I see India playing a great role. And Modi ji is fully au fait with these kinds of ideas, and we just have to follow through with them.
All right. I know this
Thank you.
interesting conversation. We're going to bring it to an end. Unfortunately, we got to get you back to continue, because we didn't talk anything about the issues relating to the impending elections of 2025. Shamisa, you have any questions for Mr. Dave?
We don't have any questions, Dr. Tara. So I'm not sure if you want to take a few minutes and discuss the elections. You can do that.
Okay, okay, okay. Professor Buru asked some question relating to the impending issues relating to the elections.
All right. Now, Ravi, when the PNC and their allies lost fair and free elections, they resorted to violence with Indo-Guyanese as targets. What should the government and the Indo-Guyanese community do in preparation for the outcome of the next election, which for most analysts think that the PPPC is going to win?
Well, there is that common that the past is a prognosticator for the future, you know, so that we shouldn't be in any way hesitant to call it as it is. I entered politics when I returned to Guyana. I was working at the grassroots in Iflat and other places with young people. When I was in Cotton Tree holding a youth camp, when the violence of 1998 broke out, and Indians were beaten like dogs in the streets of Georgetown, and the forces stood by and watched, and our people were humiliated for doing what? Simply for supporting a party, as if that's somehow criminal to have a party of their choice. So we have seen that happen at every election. It doesn't matter what, whether it is 92, 97, 2001, where I participated in those elections and won a seat, 2006. They've always been violence. It's just the intensity. So what we have seen and what we are seeing, that all I had pointed out in 2010 to the PNC, because we need an effective opposition. And I said, if the PNC continues with its kind of rhetoric, which stresses violence and antagonism and what have you, you are basically forcing Indians who may disagree with the PPP from changing their votes. So in a sense, they were doing the job for the PPP. They changed their modus operandi. They created what George Bush talks about, a kinder, gentler image, brought on Granger. But lo and behold, it looks as if they have something literally in their system where they unleash this kind of violence after 2020 by claiming that those two unfortunate youths who we now know were killed because of some drug involvement, Granger and Harmon, made it into a racial incident where you had violence against Indians again. Then when one black individual was unfortunately killed, you had people like David Hines and all that stirring up the people. You had the violence at Mount Repos. So what you have is that the PPP has, in a sense, is practicing rational politics. And what is rational politics, which I showed in 2010, which is that if we are now a nation of minorities, so no one ethnic group has a built-in majority. So the PPP cannot just count on Indians. And similarly, the Africans cannot, PNC cannot count just on Africans. Therefore, you have to what you call reach out across from the divide. So when the PPP, and I'm not PPP, I'm not a member of the PPP, I was never a member of the PPP. When the PPP does this, you have an individual by the name of David Hines, who I thought was my friend, saying these are slave catchers. So you're by having Africans vote for you, you call them slave catchers. Now, what kind of language is this? And so all this, so what they're doing, therefore, is to, you see, the moment the PPP has to reach across the divide, their language, their rhetoric, their posture has to be accommodative. And that is what you need in a plural society. So I live on West Coast. I live in Iflat. Half of my village, we call it Kashmir, is the African villages. So when President Irfan went in there and sponsored 50 chicken farms, when you have a young African activists like Tandai McAllister could now switch to the PPP. And she comes from the McAllisters, which is a born PPP family, right? James, my friend in Parliament, James McAllister. So if the PPP is making these inroads in Denamstel or Vorgelinchen, and I'm talking of what I know, I live in Iflat here, so I travel, I talk to people, then you cannot discount that. So what are they doing? They are really preparing for violence. They're talking about a list to claim that this list is bloated. What the heck about this? We all know, and they know, and the Chief Justice has ruled that you can't take off Guyanese who have registered, who may have gone abroad. And it's for that reason the list is almost to the level of the population. But this is nothing strange. Barbados is seen as a model democracy. The voters list of Barbados is 90% of the population. Ours, at least, is about 70-something percent. But Barbados is 90%. The same phenomenon operates. Asians who have gone to New York, they can still come back and vote. So nobody cries in Barbados about bloated lists. They accept the reality of that. But all that talk of bloated lists and of dead people voting and all that, as if the polling agents of the PNC are sleeping when they go there, even though they're paid. So all of that is to set up a mindset when they lose the 2025 election that, again, we was robbed. You notice in the beginning they said they were illegally installed by the Americans, the PPP. They're not using that language now because they themselves are telling the Americans, please, look into these things for me. So what is happening here? You are having the same recipe for the creation of violence against supporters of the PPP who are assumed to be Indians, which is silly because at this juncture, the PPP cannot possibly win an election unless they have done what they are doing, which is to reach across the divide and quote Amerindians and the mixed population and African Guyanese.
Mhm. Now, the PNC has a reputation for rigging elections, as you're well aware. The last attempt was in 2020, and they fortunately failed. And you have mentioned some of the things they're talking about the upcoming elections. You know, did the PPC ever rig any election in Guyana?
Well, you see, this is the nonsense that is being touted, and
Mm.
people don't really nail it.
Mm.
If the PPP were rigging elections, how then could they lose the 2015 elections?
Mm.
You are in government. I know Donald personally. Donald is from my village. He's an Eiffel man. He lived right next door. His brother lived next door to Shamisa out in
Mhm.
2nd Street there. So we
Mm.
know each other. Donald was president. You understand?
Mm.
Donald complained about 15 boxes, ballot boxes not being counted. Up to today, he claimed, he protests, but they didn't go out to the streets and start beating up people and claim that, we was robbed. You understand? They protested, they lost their protest, and they waited. They filed an election petition. Petition has never been heard from 2015. They didn't go out and create this climate because if you do these things, you're undermining democracy in a country, the premises of democracy, which is that take your licks like a man, right? Isn't that what Goling told Granger and call him a sanctimonious gangster? Take your licks like a man, huh? You get me? And come back and fight another day. So coming back to the PPP, I of course can't swear. I mean, between me and you, there's no politicians that I know that are, pure as the driven snow. But what I do know that if they were in power and they didn't rig election, how could they rig from outside? You understand? When the PPP is PNC is in charge, and we know now that all of the operatives who ran the elections from Lowenfield, from the gal, forget her name, his assistant, the
Mingo,
assistant, hmm? And
Mingo and
then Mingo is
Myers,
the returning officer, but there's this gal, Roseanne, whatever her name is.
Myers.
Myers, yes.
Mm.
So they were all PNC of PNC bent, and we know that now. Take, for example, Mingo. Up to the day when the election was completed, they all complimented themselves on running a very well run up election. Yet, so they're saying that Mingo had to intervene because of anomalies. Well, how did Mingo know of these anomalies? Is he psychic? There was no investigation, there was no inquiry when he started to change from calling out the individual SOPs to putting them on a spreadsheet, which were all with false information. So what is Mingo suddenly discovered psychic powers? So we gotta pick sense from nonsense. But this is where people who pretend to be leaders in this community gotta stand up and speak. And this is where we have to call out those who don't speak, and we'll have to man up and call them out and forget those who are friends. I have friends on the outside. I sat for 5 years on the opposition benches. All of the opposition people were my friends. Like I said, I never was a PPP. But you got to call a spade because we're talking of this country. That when
All right.
finally we have the wherewithal to develop, you're going to now unleash violence.
All right.
I grew up in America. I grew up in American business after high school and working
Okay.
20 years in corporate America. You're not going to chase away investors. Investors that could
Okay.
put their money any which way.
All right. Dr. Ganga, your last point.
Yes, in terms of the statement of polls, do we make copies, official copies on official scanners to avoid problems and miscounting and all those kinds of manipulations? I think if we regularize that and know what happens, we'll have less rigging of elections or attempts at rigging. So what do you think?
But you see, this is where it's a slippery slope, and we got to be careful not to fall into the PNC trap. We have right now a manual system where the copies are, that you press hard and it's the exact copy. You need to scan it where you can say, well, and the PNC will say it. Listen, the scanner was rigged. Somehow the scanner was rigged. The more variables you enter into this equation, trust me, whether it's biometric with your finger, whether it's your face, every one of those things they're asking for will simply be used to claim rigging. Here is a party that in 1997 agreed in Parliament that yes, we must use our national ID as a form of ID. They lost the election, then take the government to court to say nowhere in the Representation of People's Act is there a requirement that you can use that. They agreed to it, and then claim things. So people will forget that it was the same Claudette Singh who vitiated the 1997 election because you shouldn't have used ID cards that the PNC had agreed to. But yet, by the time she made her decision, 2001 election was already scheduled. So what's the point? We went along. So this is a party that will use any example to claim rigging. Let's not be fools. Let's not even go down that. Right now, you have, I vote at Ifat Community Center. You get me? And by the afternoon, they staple a copy of that. And that copy, you could see it is a copy, a photocopy. Not a photocopy. It's a copy that was, by carbon or what have you. So they can't say you put in. You could see now if you put in, right? So when Kemrad said he found some Russians, he and Kathy found some Russians who were hack it. The question, of course, is that how do you have pencil and paper? So it's not a lot of nonsense. So it sounds good, Dr. Ramdas, but I would say until look at what happened in Venezuela. Venezuela conceitedly has all of the modern innovations that you want in an election. Yet what did Maduro do? He simply refused to show the equivalent of his SOPs. And God knows at long last, Biden is now saying, listen, we don't accept what you said, right? And they're now talking about Gonzalez is the president-elect. So I would say let's go with what we have for 2025, and we have 5 years if we feel we need to change. But when you have a party, like Dr. Bodu said, that rigging is part of their political genes. From the word go, Burnham always said, from the moment he won, he knew he was going to rig. He started bribing people like Tello from the UF. He started bribing people like Naziruddin, I think, from Esquivo, I forget his name, there's a few of them from the PPP, and he knew what he was going to do. He was going to copy work.
All right. Shamiza, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Tara. Mr. Dave, we will now ask you for your closing remarks.
Well, I simply would like to compliment this panel and yourself for taking the time out. When I returned to Guyana in 1988 to come back permanently, there was this thing, and sadly by the PPP, as to where were you all this time, But I know that the Guyanese overseas who are still interested in their country, we live out the meaning of that, our naval string buried there. And you all spend more time, more effort, and more resources to find out about Guyana. And that should be acknowledged. And I want to acknowledge that I compliment the four of you for taking the time while you were abroad. There's so many other things that you could be doing, right? I'm told it's cold in New York City. But there's so many other things you could be doing. Maybe a nice eggnog you could have been sipping right now. But again, I compliment you all for taking time to be interested in your native land. And please keep it up. And those of us within Guyana can then be encouraged that, yes, we do have friends and we do have family even who may help us when the day of reckoning comes.
Thank you, Mr. Dev. I do have a question from one of our viewers. They're asking if they can get a copy of the book that you spoke about. I believe the one that you mentioned, you had like 200 copies that you transported by yourself.
Dr. Basil Mangu's book.
I still have some. So if you all have my contact, if anybody wants them, I still
So
have
Andy, who is a friend of Professor Muni, he wants to know if he can get a copy of it. So we'll figure it out and we will.
Yeah, figure it out. I do have some copies that in my library upstairs in my study. I do have some copies. I have about 20 or 30 copies still around. I still hand it out to interested people. I hand it out at certain events. Okay.
Thank you so much. Thank you to our panel. Thank you, Dr. Tara, and to all of our viewers. Thank you for taking the time to be with us this evening. To Mr. Dev, as a little girl growing up in Ocean View, I was always proud of you. And I listened to you tonight. I'm still very proud of you. I know you mentioned that not very many politicians are honest, but in you, I find honesty, I see transparency, and I see a man who has always believed in his people and his country. So thank you for everything that you have done and you continue to do for a beautiful Guyana.
Thank you,
Until next
Shamiz.
time.
I know your family. You come from a good family.
Thank you. Until next time, this is the Guyana Dialogue, and I'm your host, Shamiz Ali. Good evening, everyone.
Good
Good night,
evening.
everyone.
Thank you.